Hello, and welcome to Behind the Cloud, the show where we talk about the people and technologies behind the enterprise cloud. I'm David Clarke, and I lead the technology platform group here at Workday. Today, we're going to talk about online identity. There are well-known ways to establish your identity and prove facts about yourself in the real world. These mostly involve producing trusted documents like passports, driver's licenses, dog-eared and beer-soaked college IDs, and so forth. I know that I spent a lot of my late teens trying to prove I was older than I actually was, and I have since spent a lot of my time trying to pretend that I'm younger, hard as that may be to believe. But of course, as transactional and social life increasingly moves online, we need to solve these identity-related challenges in new ways. As the New Yorker cartoon famously says, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. But how do you prove you're not a dog? Or if you are a dog, how can you order dog biscuits online without getting hassled by angry cats? To answer these and other important metaphysical questions, I'm delighted to be joined today by Phil Windley, who's the chair of the Sovrin Foundation. Welcome, Phil.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Great. So perhaps you could give us a little bit of, and please, you're not a dog, by the way. I was afraid you might turn up.
Woof.
Anyway, maybe you could give us a few minutes on your background and how you came to be involved in online and enterprise identity.
Sure. About 15 years ago, I had just finished being CIO for the state of Utah, and I was kind of looking around for what I should do next, and a friend of mine said, you should write a book on digital identity. I thought, why digital identity? But it turns out a lot of my experience was related. And so since that time, I've been spending a lot of my effort on understanding digital identity. I run a workshop called Internet Identity Workshop, and it meets twice a year. And we've had, hundreds of people come and talk about online identity. It's just a fascinating topic.
So perhaps we could spend a couple of minutes just on the history of online identity, because a lot of the internet, including how identity is handled, grew up accidentally in ways.
The internet wasn't created with an identity layer. Or actually it was, but for machines, right? We identify machines, but we don't identify people. And in the early days, of course, that was okay because all of the machines connected to the internet were like a big mainframe. You had an account. The university or business who gave you the account knew who you were. So we just kind of pushed identity out to the edges. When the internet kind of went mainstream in the 90s, all of a sudden people were coming online that didn't have these kind of relationships, and they didn't have anybody who was saying, oh, this is David or whatever. And so we kind of got to this point where every website had to create an identity system, create your username, create your password, fill in whatever personal information they want, and then you go to the next place, and it's the same kind of thing, but just different enough that you can't automate it, you can't really do, it's just frustrating. And that's where we are now. And it's even worse now because, of course, now we're worried about security. So almost every place you go wants two-factor authentication, right? So we want to, every time you sit down to do anything, you've got to log into 36 places and, get text messages from them. It's just nuts.
Yeah, and you spend all your time trying to remember your mother's maiden name and your favorite aunt's birthday, and it's increasingly challenging. So there's obvious risks, or there's inconveniences, certainly, all of that authentication stuff, but there are also risks, as you say. So maybe you could highlight a couple of the risks associated with this patchwork of approaches to online identity.
Well, so the one risk, maybe risk is too strong a word, but just the friction that it entails for online interactions makes the internet difficult to use, frustrating at times. It means that it's more difficult for a business to go online and do what they want. So that's a real source of friction. And of course, we're all familiar by now with the hacks that seem to happen every week where millions of users' data gets compromised somehow. And that's because it's just ad hoc. Everybody does their own thing, and sometimes they use good practices and sometimes they don't. So, so now your information's out there, and what do you do?
Right, so you and the Sovrin Foundation are highly involved in advocating for a new approach to online identities.
Sure. Yeah, so if you think about online identity versus how identity works in the physical world, they're very different. You mentioned that, on the internet, no one knows you're a dog. But if you wanted to prove you were over 21 online, that's really hard. But in the physical world, it's really easy. You just pull out your driver's license and say, here's my driver's license. They look at the birthday and they say, yeah, this belongs to you. Why can't we do online identity the same way we do identity in the physical world? That is, with multiple credentials from multiple authorities that the user keeps in a wallet and uses wherever they want to prove whatever's interesting about them as long as the other party will accept that credential. So that's kind of the conceptual idea of what we call self-sovereign
Very
identity.
interesting. And I think there's obvious applications for that, which we'll talk about in some more detail in various online sort of developed world scenarios. But increasingly, identity is a more fundamental problem for a lot of people in the world who, maybe because they're stateless or they're refugees or they're otherwise displaced, are having problems proving who they are, where they came from.
There are about a billion people in the world who don't have some kind of foundational identity document. Often we think of refugees, but there are millions and millions of people who are just born in areas where they don't do this. And that's a real problem. It means they're limited with educational opportunities, with healthcare, with employment. And so just being able to get some of these identity documents, be able to bootstrap your way into a trusted relationship can make a real difference in someone's life. And sometimes it's a matter of life and death. And we have a partner, iRespond. It's a nonprofit that works to actually identify Rohingya on fishing vessels, because it turns out that the fishing boat captains just take them out, they'll dump them off overboard.
Wow.
So this is a matter of life and death to know who they are and make sure the people leaving are the same people who are coming back.
So in order to achieve some of this new capability, one of the ways that, or one of the foundational technologies is the blockchain. So for the few viewers we have who are not cryptocurrency traders, maybe you could spend a second or a minute just talking about like what blockchain is.
Yeah, well, like you say, blockchain has been widely associated with cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, but it has a more fundamental use. The reason why you want to use it for a cryptocurrency is because the blockchain allows you, without any kind of central authority, no single point of failure, for example, to exchange value with someone who you don't know, right? That's what you're trying to do with a currency. You think about that basic problem, being able to know something in a distributed way without having to, have some central authority involved. There's lots of use cases, and identity is one of those.
And how does the blockchain approach apply to identity?
Yeah, so the blockchain is very important for creating this kind of self-sovereign identity system. So in a credential exchange, for example, I want to be able to give you a credential. You want to be able to look at that credential and know something about it. One of the things you want to know is who issued it. Well, so you need some place to look that up. Right? How do you know where to look it up? That's called discovery. Right? Well, the blockchain is a good way to be able to look up a public identifier and know who that identifier belongs to. There are other things you might want to know about that credential. How was it defined? What are all of the fields? And importantly, has it been revoked or not? All of those are great use cases for the blockchain. What you don't want to do with the blockchain is store personally identifying information on it. When people think about cryptography, they kind of think of it as this, just one thing. But in fact, cryptography moves and evolves because computers get faster and better. And so the same kind of cryptography functions that you might have used 10 years ago are now no longer usable.
You mean my Enigma machine is obsolete?
It's obsolete. and if you use that to write a hash, right, in something that is permanent and indelible like a blockchain, 10 years from now, somebody can maybe break it open and find out information about you that you don't want them to know. So you don't want to put personally identifying information on the blockchain, but you do want to store important things like identifiers and revocation registries.
Makes sense. One interesting aspect about how the identity blockchain is envisaged by the Sovrin Foundation is that there isn't a concept of mining, which is commonly used in some of these blockchain systems for proof of work. So what do you do instead of that?
Yeah. So mining is solving a very specific security problem called the Sybil attack problem, which basically means that you can stand up lots of machines to impersonate somebody or to vote in your favor when you want to do something fraudulently. Another approach to that problem, rather than proof of work, is to know who the nodes are, to know who the validator nodes are in this distributed system. We like to use a permissioned ledger, and the reason is because it keeps the transaction cheap. So mining is a very useful tool if you don't know who the validators are, but it's expensive. The reason you want to keep it cheap is because identity has a very specific problem called correlation. If you use the same identifier in two different places, someone can look at those identifiers, look at the activity associated with them, and associate the activity in one place with your activity in another place. It might be innocuous, might be incredibly dangerous. We don't know.
That's the same as even using your credit card in two different places. If it's compromised in one, you have to...
And it's the real problem with Social Security numbers, right? That's why we don't like Social Security numbers. And so...
There are many reasons why we don't like Social Security numbers.
But the idea of correlation is if we can give a different identifier for every relationship, then that makes it harder to correlate the activities of someone in two different places. And if identifiers are expensive, people will be tempted to reuse them, and reusing identifiers leads to correlation risk.
Makes sense.
So we want to keep the identifiers as cheap as we can.
Okay, and we've talked a bit about some of the general use cases for online identity, but there are obviously other use cases that are more specifically enterprise-oriented.
Credentials are all around us. There are, we typically kind of think about it in a narrow way because we think just about the credentials that we have in our wallet or something else. But in fact, almost any identity document that you might encounter looks like a credential. So I flew here today, I had a boarding pass. That boarding pass is a credential because it knows, it says who I am and that I have certain rights to fly on a certain flight on a certain day. So that's an example of an enterprise grade credential that we don't typically think of as something we carry around in our wallets. But they're all over the place. The mortgage process, when you get a mortgage, it's filled with credentials. As a matter of fact, that's where all the friction is, where all the, a lot of the cost is in the credential processing. So credentials surround us. And so there's a lot of areas where we can reduce friction for businesses and for their customers if we can create credentialing systems that are standardized, that are well-known, that are secure. So that's how it applies.
So as an example, in theory, a company using Workday could publish credentials for their employees to verify both that they're employed and maybe that they earn a certain level of income.
Yeah, so that's a really good kind of, I think, bread and butter example of an enterprise credential. Most businesses of any size have some sort of employee identification. They use it internally. The employees sometimes use it externally to get discounts or other things. And so that employee credential we typically think of as a fairly simple document, right? It might just have your picture and your name and say, yeah, employed since 2007 or something like that. But in fact, a credential of employment could be a fairly extensive document. It could have all of that information, but also your current salary, your salary history, any disciplinary actions that have taken place. I know that doesn't apply to you.
I don't know what you're joking about.
and so all of that could be in a credential.
Right.
And let's say you show up at a bank and they say, yeah, we'll give you a car loan. In order to do so, we need to know you're employed, that you've been employed for a certain number of years, and that you're, make at least $75,000. So using your employment credential, you could prove all of that to the bank in a way that they can know that it came from your employer, that it's about you, that it hasn't been tampered with. Those are all important properties that we want to have.
It's nice also because you can give them just the information they need. So in that
That's
case,
right.
if I earn $82,000 and I don't necessarily want to tell them that because then they'll come and try and sell me yet more crappy credit cards.
Yeah, or you don't want to disclose your disciplinary actions because then they won't give you a loan.
Entirely hypothetical example.
But yeah, that's right. So we call that minimal disclosure, and it's a very important property of credentials because if these credentials are extensive, you don't want to just hand the entire credential over to somebody and let them pick through it and figure out what they want to know and what they don't want to know. You want to prove to them just the information that they need to know in order for the transaction you're currently in. And so minimal disclosure is a very important privacy principle.
Right, and just to dig into that for 1 second, in the entirely hypothetical example of a disciplinary record that an employer might write to a credential they had provided to an employee, would the employee be able to ignore it, delete it, hide it? So do you still have control over it?
So the employer owns the employee credential, right? I mean, that's the nature of an employment credential, is that the employer owns it. But they're going to give it to you. It might include that information. And so you can't stop them from including that information, but you can control what you disclose. Right? Okay. Now, it may be that you go somewhere and they say, we want to know about your disciplinary actions, and you choose to disclose that. And that's up to you. And that's what we mean by self-sovereign. Right? It's about the area within which you have control and the area outside of which you interact with others as peers. And that's the core idea here, is that you get to decide whether you're going to disclose that or not.
Okay, that's quite powerful. This all conceptually sounds amazing, but what could go wrong here?
Well, I think there are some risks that we have to be aware of. You could imagine solving this entire problem without the privacy controls and without the kind of user control, the identity owner control that we've talked about. And it might be amazing in some ways. It might solve some real problems and reduce some friction. But if your entire existence is dependent on someone else issuing you a single identity system that's going to control everything in your life, that can be a scary place. Right? If you lost control of your Fitbit account, you probably wouldn't be that upset. But if you lost control of the account that manages your heart pacemaker, that could be a pretty scary thing, right? So we want,
especially if it had right access to my pacemaker.
That's right. So we want to create systems where the user has control and the user has privacy, because that's how we establish human dignity and actually protect human freedom, which I think are really important online. We're increasingly getting to a place with online interactions where our privacy and is at risk. And because of that, we end up getting into a situation where online feels very different than offline. And I don't want to see that happen, because I think the potential of doing things in the cloud is so incredible. We really need to protect that.
So is there any concept that at some point credentials might have value and there might be some way to pay for them? Or
well, if you think about the physical world, a lot of the credentials you have do have some value. You paid for a driver's license, right? You bought a boarding pass to get on an airplane. All of these are examples of credentials with value. And so having a network where someone can exchange a credential or give you a credential and get value in return, I think is very important for the development of this ecosystem. We'll lose lots of use cases if you can't exchange value for the credentials.
That makes sense. So what does progress or success look like? Because obviously there's some level of chicken and egg problem here, where what you're describing is clearly useful, but until there's many issuers of credentials and many users of credentials, it's hard to get a market going. So how do you think about success and scale, and how does that happen?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I've built a couple of platform companies in my life, and that's always the big problem. And so when I first came to this, that was the first question I asked, is how do we do this? Right. And it turns out in identity, particularly with credential-based identity, that problem is a lot easier to solve, because you can imagine there are a lot of use cases where a business needs to issue a credential for internal use. And you might say, well, if they're doing it for internal use, why would they use a standardized system like Sovrin? The same reason they use the internet to connect various offices. They don't buy leased lines anymore, because it's there, it's standardized, and it works. Right? So I think one of the very first uses are going to be businesses issuing credentials within their own company, either for their employees or for their customers to use. You're going to have banks that are already doing this process. Why wouldn't they let their customers have access to this? In fact, one of our earliest and most steadfast partners has been the credit union industry. And so now, if I've got a credential from my credit union, and my credit union issued it, and you're probably going to trust that they did a pretty good job of checking my address and my name, and it's the right picture and all of those things, because frankly, they're going to go to jail if they don't, right? Now I could use this other places. So it's kind of a second order credential. And then I think probably further down the road, you're going to see primary credentials like driver's licenses and other things. We've got a few use cases of primary credentials. State of Illinois, for example, has already said that they plan to issue birth registrations on Sovrin, so birth certificates.
Wow. Would twins get identical registrations, or no?
No, hopefully different ones. Different. And the province of British Columbia is doing business registration on Sovrin. So these are foundational identity documents that come from an authority, government in this case, that are already being issued. But it'll be a while before you see that being ubiquitous. But I think we'll get there, because all of these other use cases are just kind of a chain that leads us there.
Okay, makes sense. And if companies or people want to get involved as committers or as stewards or as participants, how do they best do that?
Go to our website, sovrin.org, Sovrin. And there's lots of information. We have a library. We've got lots of papers. There's a forum where you can ask questions and get involved. So that's a great place to go.
Any reason why you chose the phonetic spelling rather than the correct spelling?
Well, the first rule of internet marketing is keep your URL as short as possible.
Should be SVRN then. Great. Well, thanks very much for coming in today, Phil. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you. It was great.
And that's all from us today on Behind the Cloud.